This year, on 4th of November, British film theorist Laura Mulvey received the BFI Fellowship, honoring the huge global impact of her work. That impact begins with a single essay written 50 years ago that forever changed how you and I watch and consume cinema. Mulvey's 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, was built on psychoanalytic theories of Freud and Lacan. Her conclusion was that the camera, the screen, and the audience were all shaped by male gaze, presenting women as passive objects for male viewing pleasure. In order to understand how this theory is being adapted for the 21st century, moving beyond the simple male female binary to include class, race, and queer identity, we spoke with Rachel Catlett, a PhD scholar from the University of Texas at Dallas, specializing in feminist visual culture. There was this interview of her that I was watching where she said that when I was doing this, when back in when she came out with it, she was like, okay, people just gonna forget it in few years,
Yeah,
but even
yeah.
now people remember it.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, Mulvey is such an interesting person and is so influential. I mean, I really think, truly, I think she is. I can't think of a single scholar who is more influential than her in terms
Oh,
of
that's
just
why.
citing and like being, how many people cite her internationally.
Yeah,
I think, you know, there are very, very few scholars who are household names, and there are a lot of people who are not in academics who know who Laura Mulvey is.
that's
So
true. Okay, so my first question is, how do you feel visual pleasure and narrative cinema is the way it is taught in the US is different from the way it is received and debated in the UK, as per your understanding?
yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think that the biggest way that we see this division reflected in sort of is more in um sort of the history of feminist filmmaking. So
Okay.
um I think that I think that visual pleasure and narrative cinema has been influential worldwide. And it's still very widely taught here in the US, and there are a lot of American scholars who cite it now. But I
Okay.
think that sort of there's a few things that are different. I think first of all, the attachment to psychoanalysis is
Yeah.
something that was resisted more here in the States than over in the UK. And I think also that there was sort of a schism in the 70s among feminist filmmakers. So in visual pleasure and narrative cinema, Mulvey calls for um, she calls for basically she calls for experimental feminist filmmaking. So she at the end she says that the way for feminist filmmakers to sort of resist the ways that Hollywood cinema is constructing these images of women is to create films that resist visual pleasure altogether. And so there's sort of this wave, more so among UK filmmakers, towards like avant-garde and experimental feminist cinema. Whereas in the United States, you have this bigger wave towards realism and feminist documentary. And so there's sort of this tension also between these feminist thinkers in the 70s and 80s, where the realists, the documentary feminists are saying, well, we need to represent the reality of women's experiences of their lives. And then you have these sort of Mulvey influenced experimental filmmakers who are saying, that we need to, that they're still using these techniques of
Yeah.
patriarchal cinema, techniques that were started with, French New Wave or Italian neorealism, these waves that were trying to represent truth or reality, but that were still very much patriarchal in their construction. And so, of course, that's not to say that there weren't British filmmakers who were making documentary and American filmmakers making experimental films. But at that time in the 70s and 80s, there was kind of a schism along those lines that I think very much has to do with Mulvey being British, and that sort of movement of like psychoanalysis and semiotics that was happening over there at that time.
And could you give me some famous examples that might come to your mind? Some famous work in the US and in the UK that could,
Yeah, for sure. So let me pull up. But yes, so obviously Mulvey's own work, so
yeah.
Riddles of the Sphinx, is a great example of this kind of experimental filmmaking. And in the US, you have things like Janie's Janie, is a great
Jeannie's
example.
Janie.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's Janie's like possessive, like apostrophe S, Janie apostrophe
Very
S.
interesting name.
Yeah. Or Joyce at 34. I believe those are both American filmmakers.
So I want to ask, do you have any personal favorite, like a favorite movie where you think that this is what Laura was talking about, that it's like,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think absolutely Riddles of the Sphinx, like her own film, I think
Okay.
is her sort of effort at showing what this filmmaking looks like. And she co-directed it with her partner Peter Wallen, who is actually also really influential in the world of semiotics, so like of signification and symbolism and stuff like that. And yeah, so I think this is like very much, and this is a cool thing about the feminist 70s in terms of film, is that academia and filmmaking were much closer. So there was very much these, academics who were writing theory about film and then making films informed by that theory in a way that was very cool. And I think they were also, I think the feminist filmmakers, because they were making these kind of more smaller independent films, were sort of more, there was more crossover between filmmaking and academia. But yeah, definitely Riddles of the Sphinx. I mean, if you want to see what Mulvey's talking about in terms of disrupting visual pleasure, that's kind of her praxis that pairs with her theory.
That's wonderful. Any contemporary movie that comes to your mind?
Yeah, so a movie that a recent film that I think very self-consciously is thinking about sort of Mulvey's ideas is actually The Substance, which
The
came out
Substance,
last year.
yes, yeah.
So it's a narrative film. It's a Hollywood film. So it's Hollywood. It was funded by movies, so it's more independent, but it's, it does, it tells a story. It's not like crazy experimental, right? But I think that this film is clearly thinking about the way that Mulvey writes about sort of how images of women are produced in Hollywood cinema.
And Rachel, you specialize in feminist body horror. How do you think that genre sort of resists, or like it reclaims the traditional or patriarchal gaze?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that feminist body horror films of the last 20-ish years or so, and especially we've seen more of these more recently, which is very exciting to me. And I think that they are actually doing some, these filmmakers making these films are doing some of the most interesting, most exciting, most disruptive work of like all of feminist cinema in sort of recent years. And we have films like I said, The Substance, like Love Lies Bleeding, which came out last year as well. and films like Poorly Farge, who directed The Substance, her other film, Revenge,
Oh, Revenge, yes, yeah.
which is also very interested in
And there's
sort
this
of.
one promising young woman.
Yes,
I'm
I've heard
not
of. I
sure. I
haven't
haven't
seen
watched
Promising
it.
Young Woman. Yeah, Emerald Fennell did that one.
Okay.
But yes, yeah, and so these films where Rose Glass's other film, Saint Maud, is also a really great one. And I think that these are films. This is what my dissertation centers on. That these are films where they show women not just in a position of enacting revenge against the patriarchy, which is what we've seen in sort of feminist horror films in the past, which is
Yeah.
exciting and fun to watch. I don't want to discount the pleasures of those films. Things like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, films
Yeah.
like this, where we see sort of the feminist figure as this avenger or sort of superhero against patriarchal or patriarchy, excuse me. And so that is exciting to watch. But for me, these feminist body horror films that I'm really drawn to, they all feature sort of women engaging in violence against themselves in a way that I think is very interesting, because I think that these films, um, they don't see it uh, as a bad thing, and I think that it's actually very psychoanalytic, which is sort of taking us back to our feminist origins in psychoanalysis with Mulvey and these
Yeah.
other theorists who are responding to her. And I think that in these films, when these women enact violence against themselves, it's not out of internalized misogyny or self-hatred necessarily, even though in The Substance it is sort of sparked by that, for example. Um, it's about voluntarily rendering themselves abject or, socially repulsive in a way that then allows them to construct a new way of being outside of patriarchy and imagine basically new ways for women to be that are not within the prescribed boundaries of our gender within patriarchy, if that makes sense.
And my next question is, you've been engaging with her work for such a long time. So how
Mhm.
do you think it has changed your own way of seeing films, or yeah, how do you engage with movies now?
Sure, yeah. So, my understanding of Mulvey has evolved so much over the years. And initially prior to studying cinema, 'cause my undergraduate degrees are not in film, they're in literature and anthropology.
Oh,
And
okay.
so then I
Yeah.
had about a 10-year period in between undergrad and grad school, where I was teaching high school and teaching film. And so I understood the male gaze in the way that, most people do culturally, which is sort of the look of the camera is understood to be male and it objectifies women, right?
Yeah.
And so that was, at the time when I was first learning about cinema, was like revolutionary. It was incredible to think about. And it sort of opened up this new world of paying attention to like the representation of women. Then, as I went to grad school and I took this class with Dr. Warren, who you reached out to, about cinema and psychoanalysis and
Yeah.
desire. We talked about Mulvey and then I actually read Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. And I understood firstly that actually what Mulvey talks about is much more complex than that. So our sort of cultural understanding of the male gaze is actually pretty reductive of her
Mm-hmm.
article,
Yeah.
of her essay. Um, and I think the parts that interest me the most then were to start thinking about like, yeah, how are women seen as a threat to patriarchal society, and um, how do they try to nullify that threat by dissecting us visually into these sort of fetishized parts.
Yeah.
And I also found it interesting, and Mulvey sort of hints to this in her article. So then I started to read articles that respond to her, right, which are about um, identification sort of against the grain, right? So, and Mulvey herself has sort of come back and taken back some of her ideas, but or sort of revised some of her ideas from visual pleasure. But there have been plenty of people now who have said, well, you know, what about queer spectatorship, right? Like, what
Yeah.
about a lesbian or bisexual viewer, a queer viewer who might also enjoy these sort of sexualized images of women? Like, what is their position in all of this?
Oh,
And
yes.
so sort of complicating Mulvey's ideas then has also been really interesting. And there's this whole wave of psychoanalytic thinking from like the 1990s, and that hasn't caught on nearly as much as Mulvey and, you know, the rest of screen theory, which says actually Mulvey's writing is not very psychoanalytic. And I do tend to actually agree with that, which is fine. That's not to say it's not still really interesting and influential.
Yeah.
Um, but and this is part of why, anyways, I won't get into all that because that's a total but you know, Mulvey's sort of an incredible, I think she, if you're interested in psychoanalytic thinking, if you're interested in you know, feminist cinema, I think Mulvey's an amazing stepping stone. And she is extremely relevant even to this day. You know, but I think also that a lot of people still cite her. I think a lot of people cite her without engaging with what's really interesting about the original article. They
Oh,
just talk about the
I totally agree with you
yeah.
on that.
I think they just talk about,
Yeah.
yeah, this reductive idea of the male gaze,
Mhm.
which she actually does not say very much in the
Yeah.
article.
Yeah.
She only uses the phrase a couple of times. It's certainly not the central part of visual pleasure and narrative cinema. And so I think instead thinking about things like, you know, address, like how do films um formally align you with certain categories of people,
Yeah.
you know, and that's certainly not just men. You can also think of this in terms of race, of class, of, you know, queerness, of all sorts of marginalized identities.
Yeah.
So I think that taking Mulvey's original piece and using this as a stepping stone to start thinking more deeply about cinema, in terms of, yeah, like dynamics of power, in terms of desire, in terms of asking yourself what is the pleasure in this moment, like things like that. I think those are all much more interesting to me than just thinking about, does the camera sexualize women, because the answer is yes. Like, we
Oh,
don't,
yeah.
that's not an interesting or deep question in 2025. Like,
Yeah. And lastly, Rachel, I would like to ask, like, given her legacy, do you think now the younger generation of filmmakers, what is one lesson that they could take back and use in their filmmaking?
yeah, I mean, I definitely think that a lot of filmmakers now are very cognizant of
Yeah.
sort of at least this basic idea of the male gaze, right? And I think that there are a lot of feminist or women filmmakers who are trying um to disrupt it and to give women characters the agency or power of the look, right? Of
Yeah.
being the one that the camera identifies with. Um, I think The Substance is a great example, like I said, of films where, and actually also Revenge, Coralie Farge's other film, both of these films seem to be very interested in the feminist politics of the 1970s, and of the filmmakers and the film academics of that time and what they were writing about. Uh, excuse me. And I think that you know, more so than just not sexualizing women, because that's complex. There are positive ways for there to be sexual images of women,
Yeah.
right? You know, I think like queer films like Portrait of a Lady on Fire, or Love Lies Bleeding. Like, I
Oh,
think
yeah.
these movies are, very interested in showing sexuality in a feminist way, in a way that gives women the agency of the look, in a way that forefronts or prioritizes women's desire. So I think that feminist filmmakers are already engaging with these ideas, whether it's because they've read these early theorists and
Yeah.
watched these early films, or just because they've sort of trickled down culturally. Um, and I think that for the moment that we're in terms of feminism, I think that returning to that theory is actually very inspiring, both for academics and for
From
creatives.
psychoanalytic critique to a global call for curiosity, Mulvey's work remains the starting point for understanding cinematic power. The BFI Fellowship confirms its influence is not just in theory, it's in the international conversation and the powerful films being made right now.